It is now live.
Great. Looks like we're rolling. Welcome, everybody. This morning is February 7th, 8:30 a.m. It's a remote hearing for the Legislative Audit Commission. We'll open the meeting. Today on the agenda, we have just one briefing, the Department of Commerce's civil insurance complaint investigation. And so with that, Ms. Randall, do you have any opening comments before we go and introduce those who will present?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. For the record, my name is Judy Randall, Legislative Auditor, and I'm pleased to be here today to release our evaluation on the Department of Commerce's civil insurance complaint investigations. It's kind of a mouthful, this one. This is the first evaluation report we are releasing in 2022. And as you may recall, last year we got off to a little bit of a late start selecting our topics. And in the end, the topics weren't selected until about June. So OLA staff worked with commission members, which we really appreciated, to try to scope our projects more narrowly this year so that we could release our reports in a timely way, but still provide information that was valuable to you all and to the public at large. So in that spirit, this evaluation is scoped a little bit narrowly. It is focused on the Department of Commerce's investigations of civil insurance complaints. The Enforcement Division within the Department of Commerce fields thousands of such complaints each year. And depending on the nature of the complaint, they either resolve the complaint kind of quickly or they engage in a somewhat longer investigation. In general, staff within the Enforcement Division investigated these complaints in a timely way. But we did find that the department's lack of written policies contributed to inconsistent practices among investigators. So we have a number of recommendations to the department, mostly focused on creating, completing, implementing, communicating those policies. Then we do have a recommendation for the legislature focused more on fraud prevention activities rather than investigation activities. So to dive into the details of those findings and our recommendations, I'd like to now turn to Jody Munson-Rodriguez, who was the manager for this evaluation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. And so with that, Ms. Munson-Rodriguez, if you could please again restate your name and your role in the organization, and then the floor is yours.
I apologize. I had to unmute myself there. Good morning, Mr. Chair and Commission members. My name is Jody Munson-Rodriguez. I'm with the Office of the Legislative Auditor. And before I get started, I would like to recognize the other members of my evaluation team, Lucas Lockhart and Caitlin Schmaltz. And I also want to see if I can get my, nope, okay. So insurance is an industry that touches most Minnesotans' lives. It can help pay for unexpected expenses after a car accident, a hailstorm, or other types of unforeseen events. It's also a big industry with policies totaling more than $46 billion in premiums in Minnesota in 2019. This can make it a target for fraud or abusive practices, and the legislature has enacted laws to protect consumers. It has also tasked the Minnesota Department of Commerce with enforcing these laws. Our evaluation focused primarily on one of Commerce's duties, investigating civil insurance complaints. So those are ones that are related to civil fraud, unfair or deceptive insurance practices, or other non-criminal violations of law. As Ms. Randall noted, our key findings included that Commerce has not adopted written policies for all civil insurance complaint investigations, which we found contributed to some inconsistent practices across investigators. At the same time, Commerce has completed most civil insurance investigations within a reasonable period of time in the last 5 years. We also noted that the department does not enforce anti-fraud plan notification requirements for all insurers. So I'm going to talk about these key findings and some related recommendations a little more in depth. But first, I wanted to kind of take a step back and provide an overview of Commerce's insurance regulation activities. Commerce has two divisions that perform more insurance-related work. The insurance division completes regulatory and administrative tasks, such as administering a licensing program for more than 165,000 licensees to operate in Minnesota. The Enforcement Division responds to consumer questions, investigates consumer and industry complaints, and reviews regulated businesses' practices. There are 4 teams within the Enforcement Division that perform insurance-related work, as shown in this chart. Those teams specialize in different insurance enforcement activities, as we show in Exhibit 2.1 on page 10 of the report, if you have that handy to take a look at. The Consumer Services Center, or we call it CSC, and the Insurance Enforcement Team, IET, conduct investigations into civil insurance complaints. We focus most of our evaluation work on the work that CSC and IET perform. The Commerce Fraud Bureau conducts criminal investigations into criminal insurance fraud allegations and related offenses. And the Market Conduct Exam Team conducts in-depth reviews of insurers' operations. Now, IET tends to take on more complex complaints than CSC, and it can pursue administrative action, including fines or suspending or revoking licenses when it uncovers violations of Minnesota law. The Market Conduct Exam Team can also pursue administrative action based on what it finds in its reviews. And if the Commerce Fraud Bureau uncovers illegal activity, it can recommend criminal charges to state, local, or federal prosecutors. Much of the Enforcement Division's efforts are focused on investigating individual complaints submitted by consumers, insurers, or others. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But they do also perform some limited proactive fraud prevention and detection activities that we took a look at. So one prevention tool is AntiFraud plans, which present an overview of an insurer's policies and practices for preventing, detecting, investigating, and reporting suspected insurance fraud. Statutes require insurers to implement and maintain anti-fraud plans, as well as notify Commerce in writing after instituting or modifying their plan. But Commerce does not enforce the notification requirements for all insurers. Now, while statutes require insurers to notify Commerce about these plans, they do not require Commerce to review the anti-fraud plans. There are 3 teams in 2 separate Commerce divisions that review them under certain circumstances, but those reviews we found are not coordinated across the teams. So we have a couple of recommendations related to that, one for the legislature and 2 for the department. First, we recommend that the legislature review Commerce's responsibilities related to anti-fraud plans and ensure that the requirements outlined in law meet the legislature's expectations. And specifically, the legislature may want to review whether it intends for Commerce to actually review these anti-fraud plans, or if it only intends for the department to gather notifications. We'll note that the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, a national standard setting organization, offers some guidance that may be useful to the legislature as it considers requirements around anti-fraud plans. And we also recommend that the department ensure all insurance companies notify the department when they institute or modify their anti-fraud plans as required by law, and coordinate anti-fraud plan review efforts across teams in order to maximize resources. So now I'm going to switch gears and tell you a bit more about what was really kind of the central focus of our evaluation, and that was Commerce's civil insurance complaint investigations. As I noted earlier, these are completed by the Consumer Service Center and the Insurance Enforcement Team. So those teams closed about 16,000 complaints in fiscal years 2017 through 2021, with a high of 3,700 in fiscal year 2020. As we show in the charts on page 21, again, if you have access to the full report, we have several charts that will kind of tell you some more information about these complaints. And they'll show you that the complaints were most frequently submitted by insured individuals. They were related to claims handling issues, including denials and delays, and most frequently about auto or accident and health insurance. Now, one of our main research questions was about how consistently Commerce has addressed civil insurance complaints. And because written policies are so important for establishing expectations and encouraging consistency across investigations, we first reviewed the policies that the department had in place. And what we found is that there are no division-wide policies in place for investigations. The enforcement division is in the process of developing policies, but they have not yet been implemented. We also found that IET does not currently have written policies to guide certain aspects of its investigations, such as its communication and data practices or administrative actions. And we found that while CSC does have written policies for some key aspects of its work, those policies haven't been well communicated. So we surveyed CSC investigators, and responses that we received from them indicated that even for activities for which CSC has adopted policies, at least some of the investigators were unaware of them. In addition, team expectations haven't been communicated in a uniform way. So an official told us that some of the written policies are actually not currently in use, while investigators are expected to follow certain practices that are not in the policies at the same time. We also reviewed the draft enforcement policies, which include policies for all the teams in the division, and CSC policies, which are specific to CSC's work. And we compared them to guidance from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. And again, you can see more details about that comparison in Exhibit 4.1 on page 29 of our full report. Overall, we found that CSC-specific policies addressed almost 50% of the recommendations we reviewed, and that the division-wide policies, if they were implemented, would address more recommendations, as shown here. But they still would not address all of them. So one example would be that the NAIC recommends that investigators update investigation files on at least a monthly basis, but the division-wide draft policies don't address how frequently investigators should update their files. In addition to looking at policies, we took a closer look at certain aspects of CSC and IET's practices by analyzing data, surveying investigators, and reviewing a sample of investigation files. One aspect of their work that we reviewed was investigative activities. And we found that CSC policies set some limited expectations for investigative activities, which included contacting the complainant and the subject of the complaint. And based on communication with investigators and looking at their data, it does appear that investigators rely heavily on communication in their investigations. On the other hand, we found that IET investigators did not always follow consistent practices. So our analysis indicated that investigators, for example, did not consistently document their activities in their case management system. One of the expectations that IET supervisor told us about was that investigators are expected to acknowledge complaints when they come in. But we found that investigators didn't record any contact, no letters, emails, telephone calls to anyone involved in the case for about 1/3 of the complaints that were closed in fiscal years 2017 through 2021. In addition, the files we reviewed did not always contain documentation we expected to see. So for instance, statutes give the department authority to charge for investigations into suspected violations of law, and investigation orders are required to bill for those costs. But we found that only 8 of the 14 files that we reviewed that ended with Commerce imposing an administrative action contained one of these orders. The other 6 didn't, which indicated that either investigators were inconsistently documenting these orders or they were inconsistently billing for the investigations. We also reviewed how quickly investigators completed their investigations. And now there are no established timeframes within which investigators must complete the investigations, but it was our opinion that most were closed in a timely manner. So as we show here, CSC closed complaints within a median of about 35 days and IET within a median of 58. And as we noted earlier, IET generally investigates more complex complaints, so it seemed reasonable to have a longer time frame there. However, as you can see in these charts, there were a limited number of complaints that were open for longer periods of time, some for several years. And staff told us that investigation durations vary for different reasons. It could be that certain complaints require more investigation than others, or some complaints may go through a lengthy administrative hearing process. And finally, we reviewed the team's communication and data practices. We found that CSE policies don't provide sufficient direction to investigators. For example, policies simply direct investigators to review complaint files for compliance with the Minnesota Data Practices Act before closing them. Now, policies don't really provide any more information than that. Make sure that you're in compliance with this act. And as all of us probably know, the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act is pretty complex. So it's uncertain whether investigators have the knowledge and resources to appropriately respond to complainants when they have questions. On the other hand, IAT investigators, excuse me, don't have written policies they're expected to follow, but they do have templates for communicating with stakeholders. So for example, if there's no apparent violation of law in a complaint, IAT has been provided with a template letter to send to complainants that simply states the department will not be pursuing administrative action without really providing details about the investigation. And most IAT investigators told us that they use the template, but others told us that they share additional information with complainants, either in writing or by phone. And so that can lead to complainants receiving inconsistent amounts of information about investigations. One other thing I'd note is that the lack of detail in the templates that IAT uses to communicate with complainants is kind of in direct contrast to CSC's current policies, which encourage investigators to share with consumers why a complaint can't be solved or resolved. So we have a few more recommendations for the department. First, that the department should adopt policies informed by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners that outline investigation and documentation standards for key components of civil insurance investigations, that they should clearly communicate the policies and ensure that investigators consistently follow them. We note that clear formal policies can help investigators know what is expected of them and that complainants and respondents are treated equitably. And by clearly communicating the policies and reviewing investigators' adherence to them, it'll help promote consistency. And we also note that Commerce should establish formal timelines for completing key tasks, such as requesting information from respondents and recording updates on cases to help ensure cases move forward in a timely manner. And while we understand that there are some complications that might require some investigations to be open longer than others, the department should establish a written policy for reviewing those cases periodically to ensure that cases don't fall through the cracks and remain unresolved. We also recommend that the department establish policies for communicating with complainants and respondents that balance transparency so investigators can promote confidence in the work that they perform with stakeholders with caution to ensure compliance with data privacy regulations. And that concludes my formal presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And I think I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Ms. Munson Rodriguez. Members, questions? No questions for Ms. Munson Rodriguez at this point? Okay, well, how about let's move then. We'll follow up. I'm sure we'll have additional questions as the agency presents. So if we could have, looks like we've got Commissioner Arnold. Do I see Commissioner Arnold? Please state your name and in your position, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, Chair Karan and members. My name is Grace Arnold. I'm the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Commerce, and I have with me today Assistant Commissioner for Enforcement. You saw the org chart in the presentation, Matt Vatter, and Director of Government Affairs, John Kelly. So I want to start off this morning by saying how much I appreciate both this committee's time and the OLA's staff's dedication to understanding our civil enforcement investigations and the really constructive feedback for improving our processes and procedures. The department's enforcement teams work diligently to prevent, detect, investigate, and respond to violations of Minnesota insurance laws. The department's CSC, which you have learned a bit about this morning, provides intake for complaints, consumer education, and attempts to resolve less complex questions or complaints that come in. When that's not possible, the CSC refers matters to the insurance enforcement team. The IET investigators are experienced insurance industry experts. All of the IET investigators either have or are working toward an associate professional in insurance regulation designations, and 2 investigators are currently enrolled in advanced designation program from the NAIC, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, which was referenced earlier. I'm sure will come as no surprise to the members of this committee and especially the members who serve on the Commerce Committee, that the volume of insurance enforcement is great. You can see some of the numbers in the report. In 2021, our CSC and IET combined received over 36,000 calls related to insurance issues. During the same period, those teams opened 5,263 investigation files and closed just over 5,000 of them. The team's combined efforts resulted in over $28 million being returned to Minnesota consumers from 2017 to 2021. The department attempts to strike an appropriate balance between instituting sufficient policies and procedures while also allowing for some investigator and supervisor discretion in prioritizing and allocating resources to sufficiently address the sometimes rapidly changing needs of Minnesotans. So as an example, in response to complaints related to COVID-19 and the civil unrest in Minneapolis in the spring and summer of 2020, the department chose to reprioritize investigative resources to respond to those crises. I do want to acknowledge, with that sort of context, the need to review, refine, and supplement the insurance division's current operating procedures and policies. We'll take the OLA's recommendations to heart, and we're committed to increasing training and communication to ensure that the CEC and IET staff are appropriately trained in the policies and procedures. We'll use the recommendations contained in the report to guide our continued improvement processes. We also understand the OLA's concern about preventing insurance fraud in Minnesota. We believe that the licensing process, our financial solvency exams, and market conduct exams play a significant role in preventing fraud, in addition to the work that the CSC and IET teams do. We believe that individual enforcement actions that the CSC and IET play that role in fraud prevention. Not only do the enforcement actions prevent wrongdoers from engaging in further acts of fraud, but knowing that there can be consequences for fraud is a deterrent from others who may engage in similar fraudulent practices. The department is committed to continuing to work with insurance companies primarily regulated in Minnesota, and will refine our cross-team processes to ensure that insurers follow the anti-fraud plan reporting requirements. We also support the OLA's recommendations to the legislature that the legislature consider and clarify its intent behind requiring the Minnesota domiciled insurance companies. So those are the ones that we primarily regulate on the financial solvency side, to notify the department of its anti-fraud plans and whether more robust reporting of such plans would better benefit Minnesotans. Finally, I want to thank the OLA staff for their time and effort through this process. There was a lot to get through, and as you can see, we have a lot of complaints. Really appreciate their really thorough and comprehensive look at our investigatory processes and policies. Sorry, it's a Monday morning. The department is committed to continued improvements to best protect the public interest, to advocate for Minnesota consumers, and to ensure a strong, competitive, and fair marketplace, to strengthen the state's economic future and serve as a trusted public resource for consumers and businesses. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Arnold. Do you have prepared remarks for Assistant Commissioner Batter or Mr. Kelly?
Nope, just me, but they're here to help me with any questions.
Excellent. You have your support team ready. We have one hand up, and so we'll take member questions. So Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Chair Karan, and thank you, Commissioner, for your presentation. I'm wondering, as I'm looking at the statute, Chapter 60A, have you found that there's ambiguities in the statute as well as what has been discovered in this evaluation, so that perhaps there needs to be more specificity in some of those sections of law?
Commissioner Arnold.
Thank you, Chair and Representative Erickson. I think you're referring to the fraud plan.
Yes,
The fraud plan.
yes.
Yeah, we support or I think, think that the OLA pointed out, I think,
Recommendations.
a good recommendation. We receive anti-fraud plans. We certainly have some process improvements that we could make, but I think understanding, what the real goal behind the legislature, or the intent behind the legislature's, original requirement that
Yes.
anti-frauds be submitted when there's a change is probably worth a look, so that we can make sure that we're doing what's expected, but also that we're resourced should there be any additional need for review beyond the kind of receipt of changes to those plans.
Representative Erickson, follow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner, do you use rulemaking as your process for setting policy, or how's policy determined?
We
Commissioner
rely on
Arnold.
the statute.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And at some time, I think we have to take roll, don't we?
Representative Erickson, we will be taking no action today, so we don't need to take roll. So
Okay, thank you.
No action taken. Representative Erickson, any other follow-ups at this point?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Frentz.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see everybody. Ms. Munson Rodriguez, excellent work as always. Thanks to you and your staff. Commissioner, just want to say how much I think the deterrent is an important part of the work that you're doing. If we talk about $28 million, thank you for that. The taxpayers, thank you. I would be willing to bet that the deterrents save more than that. And so as we go forward, looking at things we can do to firm up some of this investigative side and enforcement side, this is just one legislator saying sometimes the crimes you prevent actually save the taxpayers more money than the crimes we catch. And so looking forward to working on the legislative stuff. And thanks again, Commissioner, to you and your team. Excellent work as always. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Frentz. I didn't see a question embedded in there for the.
That was a bold statement.
Great. So Commissioner Arnold, in this particular, in the complaint that drove this investigation, when we look at it was an energy company or a solar company, and it clearly the auditor indicates that their translation is that you had no statutory authority to pursue or to continue, even though you may get early indications that it may or may not be insurance related. In this particular case, if it wasn't insurance related, and their opinion is that it's clearly outside of the insurance role in the investigation, what procedures do you use in place to make a determination on when you're operating within a very, you may deem it and probably will clarify, a gray area of the statute? What procedures are in place that you stay within the statutory boundaries? And then secondarily, how many other investigations are in motion today that are not insurance related within your organization?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. I will note that this report that we're discussing this morning is different from the special investigation. And I don't know if Auditor Randall wants to clarify the differences.
Ms. Randall.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Yeah, just to clarify for all members. So today we're talking about the program evaluation on Commerce's civil insurance complaint investigations. But as the chair noted, we did release a special review in January on the Department of Commerce Fraud Bureau. And if you don't all have that easily in front of you, we can probably email you out a link. It's also on our website. And in that special review, it was focused on a more specific allegation about whether the department and the Fraud Bureau in particular was kind of overreaching beyond its authority in investigating concerns that weren't just insurance related. And so, Senator Curran, I think, is fairly bringing up a different report that we did on Commerce. Commerce has gotten a lot of attention from OLA lately. They've been pretty gracious, so I do appreciate that. But that's what Senator Curran or Mr. Chair is referring to, is the special review. And so I'll send a note right now to see if we can send you all a link to that report so you can have it at the ready as well.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. It brings up all these areas of clarifying, this particular point, talked about the recommendations and clarifications that we need new policies and procedures. And it's always concerning when we operate, are we still within the operating lane or the jurisdiction within commerce? And so we've talked about in the past, and I think Commissioner Arnold, you weren't here, but I think in 2018 we talked about the total revenues, and I agree with from commerce that it's in far excess of the cost to operate the agency. I think it was plus $28 million or $20 million in 2018. And we understand there's a composition of those that are from fines and the deterrence. And we agree we need the deterrence because it does bring compliance into alignment. When I look at those things, what I'd like to see further broken down from your agency then is of those revenues that are brought in, those that are actually penalty based versus operational. We have the ongoing compliance issues with I forget what we call the standards and practice review with insurance companies. They pay a lot of money, and I want to make sure that you're operating within the boundaries that the excess revenue is purely generated from compliance activities and not standard operating procedures where we're overcharging insurance companies on a regular basis for that type of work. So those are always my concerns, that we're within those boundaries. So.
Thank you, Chair. And I wasn't intending to deflect the question by referring to the other report, but I did just want to make sure that the commission was clear. So, to that point, fraud is often complex and involves many things. And so I think we can certainly answer some of the questions. I don't have I think particularly some of the financial items that you brought up at my fingertips, but certainly happy to provide any information that would be helpful there.
Thank you, Ms. Arnold. Yeah, those are it's a complex process. I think the insurance industry certainly has no problem paying for those things that they, from the fraud investigation, we all benefit from that, and so they're willing to pay. We want to make sure that's very clear. And I think not only are they paying for those things that are statutory within your realm, that we don't pay for other things that aren't. And then from a procedures, I think the recommendations, it's always somewhat startling to me that, sometimes it appears we go back to, well, I wish we just, had great standards practices. Anybody's going to be investigated within the organization, and both sides need to have ample and thorough communications regardless of the outcome. And I think that recommendation, one, should have been a standard practice in everyday activities. These are really serious matters. And when you brought in under investigation, people on both sides, the complainant as well as those that are being investigated. And so we want to make sure that we're not here 2 years from now and make sure that we over communicate with both sides, because boy, if there's one thing that we're all here for is make sure that citizens have access to government and that there's clarity and transparency when it involuntarily or voluntarily it touches you. So those are the things that in your world, the insurance fraud, it's important that we continue to do that. So we appreciate you accepting the recommendations. We would appreciate having the next audit come through and with 4 stars. So Commissioner Arnold, any comments?
Thank you, Chair. Well, if there are stars for audits, then I'm happy to, I would love as many as they can give. But yeah, I appreciate especially the comments about, making sure that Minnesotans kind of understand within the bounds of Minnesota data practices law, which I think was noted earlier is quite complex. And so I'm grateful to our legal team for helping us sort through what that means in this context. And certainly we'll be reviewing our processes and procedures. I do want to note that we will be, as we noted in our letter in response, to the other investigation, that we'll be pursuing a legislative solution to the authority of the Fraud Bureau. And then I think funding is obviously a conversation that will go along with that. And so the governor's budget includes some general fund funding to help to sort of supplement and allow the Fraud Bureau to take on some of these complex financial crimes where insurance may be involved. And then if insurance isn't involved, that there's some funding outside of the insurance fee to support that.
Thank you, Commissioner Arnold. I think it really does highlight, the intense attacks on state government, federal government across the board, not just insurance fraud, but we look at through DHS, the entitlement fraud, unemployment, UI fraud. I think we will be having a much larger conversation outside of just commerce and your role and authority. We got to make sure that from cybersecurity and every facet that we put together an investigative arm that has the full authority to investigate fraud. I think we're the #1 target moving forward in every aspect of the threats upon us in the fraud and the theft of our resources. So we'll welcome you at the table as we will have a much broader conversation about the role of commerce in the future, the role of the OIG in DHS, and all other investigative arms from a cybersecurity perspective, and to make sure we have the tools necessary. I think it's due for a much larger conversation. So we will be having that conversation. With that, members, I don't see any other hands up unless Representative Erickson and Mr. Frentz haven't taken their hands down unless they have follow-up. Anybody else have any members have any questions? I see the hands coming down. If no other questions, I think we will no further business before us. Unless any member has a comment or question. There's no other business before us. We will adjourn the Legislative Audit Commission. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you.